Has anyone here been to the Lorraine Hotel and this Civil Rights Museum? Oh. What year were you there?
What year was I there? 74. 74.
I was even born now.
All right, get started here. My name's Evan Rose, and I'm doing the forum for today. This past summer, I went to my 50th college reunion, and on the way, as I often do, I looked for places to stop. And I had been through Memphis 10 years ago, and I had seen that there was the Lorraine Motel, which is where Martin Luther King was assassinated back in 1968. And I hadn't realized that it had become a museum. So I didn't get a chance to visit there in 2012, but 10 years later, when I went to my most recent reunion, I stopped there to see it. So the picture you see on the left there is the Lorraine Motel, and that picture I actually took in 2012. And on the right is a wreath. That's where Martin Luther King was killed. And then there's a little plaque in the front there, and I'll read that to you. It's a quote from Genesis. They said one to another, "Behold, here cometh the dreamer. Let us slay him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." Does anyone recognize that quote? It's the brothers deciding to kill Joseph. Joseph is the dreamer. With much of Martin Luther King's career, there were biblical references, and this is one of those made after his death. Okay, so the Lorraine Motel was historic in that it was owned by a black man, and he operated it for many years, and it was a place where black people could stay as they traveled around in the South. And if you know something about history, you know that that was a rare thing to be able to find a place to stay. I believe there's a book called story called The Green Book. The Green Book was about places you could stay in the South if you were black. The National Civil Rights Museum opened in 1991. It was renovated and updated 2012 to 2014. And what had happened was that the museum was opened in 91 because that's when it became, it no longer was a motel. And if I understand right, the state of Tennessee owns it now. And the renovations were to make it, modernize it and make it more interactive, as most museums are today. And so you get a chance to see this, which is, you know, less than 10 years old. So when you first go in, the introductory part is about slavery and gives you an explanation of how it operated. In the upper right is a statue, two statues, a man basically auctioning a woman and her baby. And then down below is, it's hard to see in this light, but it's a model of a ship, and those seated figures are there giving you some idea about how cramped the quarters were on a slave ship bringing people from Africa. Then there's a display here about Africa and the societies and where the people came from. And you'll notice that there are sites along the west coast of Africa that indicate where a lot of the slaves came from, the ones at least that were destined for the Western Hemisphere. What this doesn't show is on the East Coast there was also a slave trade, and that slave trade was operated mostly by Arabs and serviced a lot of the Arab world. One of the things I discovered in my reading fairly recently is that slavery had existed for a long time in Arabia, but with the coming of Muhammad and the conversion to Islam, it was forbidden to make slaves of fellow Muslims. And so the Arabs turned to Africa. Okay. There's also a little bit of display in terms of the culture of the West Africans who became slaves, showing some of the dress. So here's an outfit that someone would have worn from that area. So then, from kind of a background, where do the people come from? How does slavery work? We get to more of the economics, and this was something that really caught my attention because it got into sort of the finer details of how did slavery operate and why was it so tenacious. And they had this nice display showing the different products that slavery produced throughout the South and where the wealth came from. And so it went into four products: tobacco, rice, sugar and rum, cotton. All of these were plantation products and required a lot of labor, and also tended to be high profit items in terms of return on investment. And then another part of the economics are the slaves themselves as human property. The value of the slaves, as the exhibit explains, exceeded the value of many other industries in the United States at the time. It was sort of the preeminent source, what would you call it? Just wealth of the nation. And so you think about it, there was a great economic benefit in this institution, but it was also kind of uniformly understood that it was an evil at the same time. And I think the reason it persisted so long was just that it was so very profitable. And that's the point that they're making here. So then it goes from slavery, where did the people come from, what was the wealth that developed, to resistance to slavery. This is before the Civil War. So there is a panel that discusses different people, their contributions, and the aspects of resistance to slavery. One of the quotes here that caught my attention, that's the one from the image in the lower right. You cannot be more oppressed than you have been. You cannot suffer greater cruelties than you already have. Rather die free men than live to be slaves. And that was Henry Highland Garnet in 1843. So then going from the pre-Civil War, we go to post-Civil War, where we're dealing with, it's hard to see, but in the upper left, that's Jim Crow laws. And so after the Civil War, there was a return, there was a brief period and then a return to oppression. And then this part of the exhibit talks about how people then worked for civil rights and some of the incremental progress that was made. So one of the people that is celebrated is Charles Hamilton Houston. And in this display, they were talking about how he won a case in 1936 to have a black man admitted to the University of Maryland School of Law. It was one of the issues for a long time was that although black citizens paid taxes and supported public institutions, often they were barred from those institutions. And so there was a steady chipping away at those restrictions. Board of Education is the one that's familiar to most people. I believe that was 1954. And so this was on the road to that. Charles Hamilton Houston was the first black editor of the Harvard Law Review. He directed the Howard University Law School, and that school produced Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. He was also the first head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So then there are other displays here go on to talk about sort of the pillars or the elements of black community. So they've got church, homes and land, education, the black press, arts and entertainment. And some of these exhibits are also interactive, where you can go up to a screen or you can listen to a presentation. Then the exhibits continue to talk about more modern day protests, things like in the 1950s up through sort of the present day. So there were bus boycotts. That was in, I believe, 1955, the Rosa Parks. There's an exhibit here on people who were kind of victimized as they tried to work for civil rights. Then this one I found interesting, the nonviolence ethic. And so here's a pledge, sort of, I guess, a covenant, if you will. And so people who are going out to do this nonviolent work, you know, they were trained. So you didn't just sort of volunteer and go out, you got training. And sometimes the training involved people who were giving you the training to practice humiliating you so that you would be able to bear the abuse that you would face if you were at a lunch counter or on some other demonstration. You were ready for that, so you didn't have to face that for the first time. So I'll read this. I hereby pledge myself, my person and body, to the nonviolent movement. Therefore, I will keep the following 10 commandments. 1, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. 2, remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. 3, walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. 4, pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. 5, sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. 6, observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. 7, seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. 8, refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. 9, strive to be in good spirit and bodily health. 10, follow the directions of the movement and the captain on a demonstration. I sign this pledge having seriously considered what I do and with a determination and will to persevere. Kind of inspiring. So then of the exhibits, and there were many, there were exhibits on lunch counter demonstrations, and it's fairly comprehensive. But this was the one that caught my attention. This is looking from above. There's a second story down on this bus, and this is a replica of the bus that was actually burned. The Freedom Riders were attacked in Anniston, Alabama, and the bus they were on was set on fire with them inside. So the story behind this was that interstate bus travel was desegregated. So we saw earlier Hamilton, who was trying to work for desegregation, getting a student into Maryland, for example, University of Maryland. So there were some tools, there's some levers that could be pulled, and one of them was through the federal government. And the way that you pulled that lever was there was federal interstate commerce, which the federal government has jurisdiction over. And so if you couldn't go and do something with the individual state, you could kind of get to them by doing something like interstate commerce. And so that was the idea here, was the bus travel is desegregated. And so the Freedom Riders were a group that would ride interstate buses in integrated groups. So this bus, the original of this bus, was attacked at a bus terminal in Alabama, and then it was stopped again and attacked on the highway. It was firebombed, the passengers were inside. They were holding the doors shut so that people could not get out, but then the gas tank on the bus began to burn, and people ran away because they didn't want to be engulfed by an explosion. The people on the bus got off, and then they were beaten by the highway, and later also arrested, the passengers on the bus. So I found this to be rather chilling and also a real vivid demonstration of what was happening at the time. You know, you can read about it, but I think seeing it really brings it home. I found another article. It's a USA Today Associated newspaper called The Tennessean, and in 2021, they ran an article about the Freedom Riders. It was the 60th anniversary, and so they talked about various museums where you could see exhibits on the Freedom Riders, and they also showed a bus, a picture of a bus, I believe it was this bus, that had been set on fire as part of a, I don't know if you call it a celebration, but a commemoration of the original attack. And that was done in 1991 on the 30th anniversary, and coincidentally the year that this museum opened. And then also in the museum is this, it's a garbage truck. And if you remember, Martin Luther King was in Memphis as part of his Poor People's Campaign, and he was there to promote the sanitation workers. And at the time, they were treated very poorly, and there were two tiers of sanitation workers. There were the white sanitation workers, who typically drove the trucks, and if their work schedule was cut short by bad weather, they were paid for the rest of the day, whereas the black sanitation workers were typically the guys who threw the garbage in the back and did all the really basic manual work. And if their workday was called short, they were not paid for the rest of the day. So Martin Luther King was in the process of, you might say, broadening his campaign to be more inclusive of poor people in general beyond black people. The museum also has a display, which I haven't shown here, that addresses some of that. That in the campaign for black civil rights, there's also been a parallel campaign and an emphasis on general civil rights, including things like farm workers, which most people are familiar with. So after I visited Memphis, I went on, I wanted to see Harper's Ferry. And several years ago, I gave some talks here. One was on a different tour that I took through the South on civil rights, and that was Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery. And I also once gave a talk on John Brown, and there was an exhibit for John Brown in the Akron Art Museum some years ago, and John Brown had spent some time in Akron. So I was interested in seeing Harper's Ferry. So Harper's Ferry was in 1859, 2 years before the start of the Civil War. And some people would say that John Brown was instrumental, certainly instrumental, in increasing the tensions and the animosity between abolitionists and people in the South through this raid. So that's a famous picture, and I've forgotten the name of the artist right now, of John Brown and his almost biblical stance here. Oops. So Harper's Ferry was a federally owned, it was a government town. So much like Los Alamos was a government town to produce nuclear weapons, to research and produce nuclear weapons, Harper's Ferry was an armory that produced the muskets and then later rifles that were used with the American Army, the United States Army. And so this has kind of a depiction of what it looked like back in the, around the time of John Brown. And you'll notice there are two rivers. One is the Shenandoah and the other is the Potomac. So this is where the confluence of those two rivers comes together. And it's also was the Achilles heel, if you will, of Harper's Ferry, because from time to time it would flood. And so if you go to Harper's Ferry, there's not much in the way of original buildings anymore because it's been flooded several times. So this is what it looks like if you go through the town. There's kind of it's a national site. Forget if it's a park or just a monument. But upper left is one of the town streets. Down below is some old bridge work. There's a tunnel that you can barely see in the middle towards the right. There's a railroad tunnel there. And then there's a display of rifles and muskets. So the idea was John Brown was going to go there. He was going there with a group, I believe it was 24 people. The idea was there would be this, he'd start an insurrection. The local slaves would rise to join his group, and they would take the weapons and then sweep through the South and continue. It would be a self-sustaining rebellion. But it worked out very badly for John Brown, and by the second day they were defeated. It took about 36 hours, and about half of them were killed, and most of the rest of them were hanged later. So it didn't work out. And many of the people who knew of his plans thought it was crazy and that it would not work. And indeed, they were correct. So there's a whole panel of quotations there. As you go around, there's a very nice display that talks about John Brown and his attempts, gives you the background, gives you some history. Here's a panel of quotes that's there. There's also a little film that you can watch that talks about the insurrection. And these quotes are interesting, and it goes to the concept that people knew that slavery was an evil, even the slaveholders did, but yet they continued in the practice, which I haven't quite figured out. But so here's one by George Washington, 1786. There's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it, slavery, but there is only one proper way and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority. So I don't know if maybe this is like taking a problem and kicking it down the road, but it's sort of like we got to do something about it, but now is not the right time. Is kind of what he's saying, and I think we saw that in the civil rights movement in the '60s because there was a plea by some people to go slow, and that it just infuriated the civil rights workers because, you know, how slow can it be? And so there are some other quotes here. Some of them I found interesting because they basically stated it like, um, find this. So Stephen Douglas, okay, who was running against Lincoln. I do not think that the Negro is any kin of mine at all. I believe that this government of ours was founded and wisely founded upon the white basis. It was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity to be executed and managed by white men. So, I mean, that was a freely stated opinion at that time, and this man stood behind that, and it has some echoes and things that we hear today. All right, I won't belabor this. So when John Brown went in, there were a bunch of lances. They didn't have a lot of firearms, but they did have these that were made specifically for the insurrection. They were going to Harper's Ferry to augment their weapons with firearms. A little display in the upper right. And then there's this sort of cast of characters here about it, who was involved in the raid. Another thing that I found interesting was there was a group called the Secret Six. Have people heard of the Secret Six? Okay. So the Secret Six were 6 abolitionists who backed John Brown financially. And turned out one of those people was Theodore Parker out of Lexington, Massachusetts. And he was one of the Secret Six. Well, after John Brown was apprehended and put on trial, it came out who these people were. And 3 or 4 of them were just mortified that they were discovered, and especially now after having backed an unsuccessful insurrection. Some of them fled, some of them tried to hide, but Theodore Parker did not. He was one of 2 who sort of stood up and said, yeah, that was me, and I'm proud of it. So I thought that was interesting. Frederick Douglass was involved in a way. He visited John Brown in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, before John Brown took his group to attack Harper's Ferry. Douglass did not participate. Douglass was one of those people who looked at this and said, this is nuts, this is not going to work, I can't back this. To cover the fact that the reason he was in Chambersburg was to meet with John Brown, who was going under the name Smith, he gave a lecture. And Chambersburg was a hotbed of abolitionist fervor and a stop on the Underground Railroad. Let's see. Interesting, so there's a plaque that you can see if you go to Chambersburg, and I did stop in Chambersburg and walked around the town. So it says, boarded in this house for a while in the summer of 1859 under the name of Smith. While in Chambersburg, he secretly received firearms and ammunition. Later in 1859, Brown led a raid on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. So in 1864, the Confederate Army came in to Chambersburg, and they held the town for ransom. They said, well, give us $500,000, and ostensibly that was to pay for the destruction of homes by the Union Army in the Shenandoah Valley. They said, give us the money or we'll burn down the town. And the people could not come up with the money, so they burned down the town, the Confederate Army. I found that was interesting. Oh, and if you go there, there's a reenactment of that every year. And then on a more positive note, I stopped in Cumberland in Maryland. It's a railroad town. And they were having their Juneteenth celebration, and so this was Sojourner Truth, a float that they took through town. So, well, history lives on, I guess. Does anyone have any questions?
When you showed the garbage truck and stated about the settlement that they made, did you hear what was? I mean, did you know the purpose of that garbage truck besides being a representative of the two black men who were found dead and that were part of the movement, and they were really just camping out, just hiding out, and they were after not so that people would not find them.
So they were in the truck, and then they were found. They were murdered. Okay. Thank you, Susan.
When I was in high school, the Catholic priest that was heading our religion class said, "I'm going to be marching in Vicksburg, and we're going to walk 6 miles to the river and back, and it is to express our feelings or our disgust about the two men who died." And they were in the negotiating party for getting them a better raise. And they did get a better raise, but it was nothing. I mean, it was just minute. They were going to get paid for a day. That was how much they accomplished in that 3-month transaction or discussion. And that's what we marched against, with the fact that they were found, those two people who had been voices for the other people were found dead.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, so Susan was filling us in on some of the details regarding that the garbage truck. I would say that I cannot really do justice to the exhibits at that museum, at the Civil Rights Museum, in a short talk like this. And I would say that you could easily spend multiple visits going to that museum, and you would continue to learn. I found that also what was interesting to me was I went to a museum that was in Birmingham, and I found that that museum also had a lot of similar displays to the one in Memphis. And so you don't have to necessarily go to the Memphis one to learn about the civil rights activities. You can learn that at other sites as well. So I encourage you, if you find yourself in one of the cities, typically in the South, where you can find one of these civil rights museums, they're well worth a visit. And I've been to probably 4 or 5 now. Yes. Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Just sort of a thought that came to me as you were talking about the 4 crops that slavery really enabled to flourish and be enormously profitable, and then there was human property. And from reading that book, Caste, it sort of lays out all the different pieces that create a very, very strong caste system. And one of them is that if you define the worth of the child by the state of the mother rather than the father, then you can hold all these children that are being born as a result of rape. You can hold them in bondage just like the mother is held in bondage. and that was contrary to English law. English law sort of defined a child's status by the status of the father. But early on in the 1700s, slaveholders had figured out that if you define the child by the state of the mother, then you can just have a whole lot more slaves. And so I guess what occurred to me was just that there's a tendency to think of white masters having sex with their black enslaved women as being about oppression or lust, but it was also just enormously economically incentivized. And especially if white people in the South thought of paler skinned enslaved people as being more valuable than darker skinned. You know, often the house servants and so forth were going to be mulattoes. And so I think it's just that whole thing about how the wealth of human bondage got expanded through that particular piece of it is something we don't think about very much, but just it's been on my mind more since reading Caste.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. Okay. Anything else? All right. Thank you all for coming, and hope that's been interesting and maybe educational.